The opinions expressed are those of the host and guests of this program and are not necessarily those of station staff, management, or sponsors. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. It's time to Ask a Rabbi. Call in with your questions and comments at 340-1590. And now, here's your host, Rabbi Shafir Lobb.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb. Welcome to Ask a Rabbi on this beautiful Friday morning here on the Treasure Coast. Please feel free to give me a call. Ask me any question you might have at 772-340-1590. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of upcoming holidays. We've got, this weekend, we've got Tu B'Shvat, which is a small holiday. That's the New Year's of the trees. That one I'm not going to talk about since it's not all that major and it's going to be here and gone real quickly. So I'm going to turn my attention rather to some of the spring festivals, that of Purim, which most people don't hear about, and a little bit about Passover, or Pesach, which a lot of people do hear about. So I'm going to tackle the big one before the little one. We'll talk about Pesach first, and then we'll come back and pick up Purim. And again, feel free to ask any questions. So the Jewish festival of Pesach, which is usually called Passover in English, and I actually wish that wasn't the case. I wish it was a different name, but that's life. It's what it is. And part of that's because it for people who aren't Jewish, often leads them to not understand the holiday. So what is Pesach about? Well, it's the spring festival, and originally it was the time of the lambing. So let's go back a little bit and let's look at Jewish holidays and how they evolved into what they are today. So when we look at a biblical holiday, particularly a major one like Pesach or Passover, there are three components to it. There's a shepherd's festival that goes with it. There's a farming festival. That's part of it. And then there's a spiritual festival. It's got all three. And in fact, Pesach actually has all of those names. It's called Chag HaPesach, the festival of the Pesach, and I'll tell what that is in a little bit. And the festival of Matzah, Chag HaMatzot, which is the unleavened bread, which probably looked a lot more like a tortilla than the cardboard that resembles the box it comes in, that I happen to enjoy some brands of. Some do taste a little bit like the box. And then the third name for the holiday is Man Cherutenu, the time of our freedom. And so it's worth noting that, and I always have fun with this one in the class when I teach world religions at IRSC, which is to tell people that Pesach is really not at all about blood. That's really not a deal, other than the fact that when the lamb is slaughtered, of course, the blood goes into the ground. That's the Jewish method of slaughter of an animal, because the neck is slit. And so that's the shepherd part of the festival. Let's back up and look at that a moment. If I'm a shepherd and God has been good to me and I have 100 new little girl sheep this year and they're running around and they're bleating and they're just bleating, not bleeding, bleating with a T. Right, that noise. Right, that's bleating. And they're running around doing that and they're just about ready to come up on their first birthday. Right, they're about to be a year old. Well, what does a little girl sheep do when she hits about a year old? What do you think she...
Oh.
He's saying TMI. Stuart just walked in. Just walked into the studio. So he's got his ears covered. So, right, they're about to go into rot, into estrus, and which means that they now can have little girl sheep themselves. And if I have 100 young little girl sheep, by the odds of nature, how many boy sheep has nature or God blessed me with?
Probably about the same number.
About the same number, right? Because we're, just like humans, sheep are pretty much 50-50. How many boy sheep do I need for those 100 girls?
Not many.
Not many, right? a handful, right? You really only need one, but that's not smart. It's no shepherd is going to go down to one male. They're going to always have a handful, whatever they can manage, because the more males you can manage, the more diverse your gene pool. But on the other side of it, it's not easy to manage boy sheep, right? They do something, right? Right? They've got these cute little horns, and they butt things, and they'll fight. They'll fight to the death over the joy of finding a young lady who's, really attractive. So, what do I have if I've got 100 boy sheep?
A problem.
A problem, right? So we're going to have a lambing festival or a slaughter of the yearling.
It doesn't seem fair, does it?
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's just unfair, and it's discriminatory, and I think the girl sheep need to start a Me Too movement.
I don't think the girls are that worried.
But then they're not like then they're not like human women.
No.
Little boy sheep that we have to worry about.
Women are not sheep. That's true. Very good, Stuart. Good point. Women are not sheep. That was a really good. So we've got all these extra little boy sheep running around. And
if you asked them, they would not say they were extra.
No, I know that. Each one would say, I'm the one you should keep.
That's right.
Right. And the bottom line is any that weren't suitable for a breeding program would have been slaughtered and eaten in the course of the year. But you're still left with, probably 80 to 90 yearling male sheep, which is what the Pesach is. It's those surplus males, which I realize that for every male listening to me, they're going like, no, we're not.
We must manage the flock, though.
We must manage the flock, right. This is an animal husbandry issue, and it also has to do with being all shepherds roam because sheep are notoriously good eaters and clean out they'll destroy disposable males. Somebody's saying to me. There you go. Yeah.
I can relate.
Gotta eat.
Dating in your 50s.
Okay. I'm not even touching that. So if you're going to be slaughtering that much sheep, yes, you're going to dry some of the meat and turn it into jerky and all those other kinds of things. But you really can't have a whole lot of sheep. They don't have freezers. They don't have refrigerators. So what are you going to do? You're going to invite a bunch of people in for a festival. That's how festivals get started. Is you don't have the strawberry festival when you're not harvesting strawberries. It's because if you don't have a festival, they're going to go bad, and you want to eat them all up. So this is the time
and charge a gate admission.
And that's probably true, right? They're going to charge the non-shepherds, or they're going to trade with the farmers who have the wheat, etc. Okay, so that's the Pesach. The Pesach is that yearling male, right? That disposable male, as Skip said. So, it's going to be those, and there's going to be like almost like a factory kind of slaughtering going on because you've just got so many, and so it's set up to do that. That's one aspect of the festival. The second aspect of the festival is the new wheat. It's also when the winter harvest, the winter wheat, is harvested. And this is where you get into the challenge because you really need to get all of the old wheat out of your storage bins. Anybody who's ever dumped new food on top of old food knows that now everything's old. Right. So you can't do that, particularly not with wheat, because in that environment, if wheat gets wet and it's underground, which is where a lot of the storage facilities, we know archaeologically that's where they are and were, then if it gets wet and it's dark, it can grow a really, really toxic bacteria. So you've got to get that out. You got to scrub down, clean the area, open it up, air it out, and then you can bring the new wheat in. Well, if you do that, then you don't have any dough. You don't have any old wheat milled around ready to make bread. So you're going to be in a hurry once you get the new wheat in the ground to make it into bread. And that's why the first breads were probably the tortilla type. And then later on, because it would take a day or 2 or 3 for enough yeast to get into the dough. They didn't have Fleischmann's. Right. They couldn't go and get the instant wheat or any of the other baker yeasts that are wonderful. And you spoonful in, watch it go frothy, and it's really easy to make bread. But in the old day, you set it out, and over time, it collected yeast from the air. And that's why the restriction on unleavened bread, that you can't let it sit wet for any length of time because yeast might get into it. And that's so you quickly mix it, bake it, and that way the yeast doesn't have any time to get active. So that's the Chag HaMatzot, the festival of the new wheat. Coincidentally, some scholars think that the old wheat probably has something to do with the death of the firstborn. And people always go, well, you have to understand a couple of things about it. Egypt, if the story in scriptures is the least bit accurate, Egypt has had a total winter wheat crop failure. The hail came and damaged the crop, and scripture says that the locusts ate what the hail did not. So that's a total crop failure, and Africa periodically has crop failure. So we've airlifted bread and things like that different times. Right. So they're having a crop failure. Well, if they have a crop failure, they can't clean out the old wheat. Right. They still have to eat, so they're going to go dig into that. Why is that a problem for the firstborn? Here's the piece you need to know. Firstborns get a double cut, and they get it off the top. So if you've got wet grain and it's starting to get bacteria and become toxic, then the worst toxin is up toward the top. And if the firstborn rather gets a double cut, they're going to get a double cut of that toxin. And nobody else is going to get sick because it's just not going to be enough of a dose of it. They might have a stomach ache, but they're not going to keel over and die. And so it appears to mysteriously affect the firstborn. And this is, to me, kind of interesting, right? Because as a psychologist, right, the psychology part of me says when you test something, you need to make sure you're testing what you think you're testing. Because very often you're not. And so when we look at why are the firstborn stricken, if you don't know about this custom of the firstborn getting a double cut, then you have no idea why the firstborn are at risk. And that includes animals. The firstborn animal gets a double cut. This was just the tradition for all firstborns. So they're being put at risk by the tradition. And why are not the Jews affected by it? Because it tells us that Goshen did not have the hail. Goshen did not have the locusts. The Jews in Goshen did not have a crop failure. They were able to bring in the new wheat and clean out and not have the toxin. So it's clearly an interesting year. There's stuff going on. There's also, if they did get, if the wheat did get wet, and it probably did, remember that the water had turned red. That's an algae bloom. We certainly know about algae bloom here on the Treasure Coast. So if they had an algae bloom and that got into the wheat, that may be the source of the toxin. So it makes it very, very likely. And again, if Goshen didn't do it, they probably had a different water source. So it's just far enough out of the towns of where Pharaoh and we don't know how, again, when the Bible says it's widespread, that might mean just Pharaoh's immediate community, right? Widespread is not as wide as it would be today. Sorry, it's just, the world was just not as big, and we didn't have CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and whoever else to interconnect us so that we find out what's going on in Poughkeepsie down here in Port St. Lucie.
Yeah, and the food wasn't sent.
It didn't migrate.
It was always local.
Yeah. Right.
It had to be.
Well, spices would travel. Mm-hmm. Spices would travel up and down the Silk Road, along with ideas and rats and plague and things like that. Yeah, all those wonderful things that went up and down the Silk Road. And that reached Egypt. Right. So that's a little bit of insight into the Chag HaMatzot. So it's that new wheat. And that's why the instruction is don't leave anything of the old wheat around. Because if it's toxic, it doesn't take a lot to infect the new wheat that you put in. So that's the second part of the festival. The third part of the festival, and the biggest one for Jews actually, because we're not as many Jews are shepherds and farmers anymore. Most of us live in cities now. It's the time of freedom, Zman Chiritzenu, the time of our liberation. Right? So it's coming out of Egypt and becoming a people. That's the theme. And what's the importance of coming out of Egypt? We get to go home. We get to go home. Right? It's been a temporary sojourn of 400 and some years, but it's a temporary sojourn. Still immigrants, undocumented workers.
And we didn't have MapQuest, which took us 40 years.
Or
Right.
borders, though, really.
Yeah, well, it's going to take us 40 years to undo the 400, but yeah, we didn't, yeah. And there's a great line. Moses starts out Deuteronomy by saying it's an 11-day journey from where we got out of Egypt to here.
How did they define days?
There we go. Okay. So it's not a very far distance. And there's another point in it where it says, God said, stop going around this mountain, just move. You're driving me crazy. Apparently we were rotating around some mountain area and just constantly going back and forth, and probably the sheep and the cattle had just totally overgrazed. But that would be my guess. And I'm sure that moving just that whatever number of people it was and getting it organized and all of that. 40 years. Yeah, there's another one. How many years is 40 years? 40 is arba, and the word for many in Hebrew is harbe. They sound awfully alike. They share the same roots. Yeah. So you have to understand, so it's a biblical number. I don't know how long people wandered, a generation or two. Whatever it would take to be able to go from a migrant worker mentality to being able to govern yourself. Excuse me, and govern land. Because right when we come into the land, we're going to have land to deal with. Whole different set of issues. Not just, because people who migrate do take care of the land, but they don't have the same kinds of responsibility of things like rotating crops, because they simply migrate to where the crops are naturally growing. So when you start to farm, you've got a whole different set of requirements and parameters. But I digress. Thank you, Stuart.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, okay. And so it's the time of our freedom. It's the time of coming into being who and what we are. So, okay. It is said that you need 3 things to celebrate the festival. You need a little bit of the Pesach of that lamb, about a large olive or a small egg amount. So we're not talking a couple of lamb chops. We're talking maybe the heart of one lamb chop. And you need some matzah, some unleavened bread. And third, you need some bitter herbs, so you remember what it was like during the time in Egypt. And you're supposed to have a meal of eating those 3 things. My guess would be that what you probably did was you took whatever meat you had, you wrapped it inside this unleavened tortilla, and you threw some herbs in with it. And that would be a good meal. That was probably what people ate for Pesach way back when. So how did it come to be the Seder that we celebrate now? Well, around the year 67 to 70, Rome destroyed the temple in one of its gallant moves, she said a little bit sarcastically. Destroyed the temple, and when the temple is destroyed, it stops the ritual of the lambing. Lambs are no longer done on an annual lambing festival, and individual shepherds just do it whenever they do it. And so you no longer have the Pesach, the lamb part of the ritual for the meal. All you've got left is the matzah and the bitter herb. And you no longer have the old style gathering, whatever that was like, probably, roasting and all that other good stuff that goes on in festivals. And it changes. The rabbis look around and very consciously say, how should we celebrate the holiday now? What should we do? And they look to up and down the Silk Road, and they find out that the Zoroastrians have a festival called Nowruz, and they create a platter with spring vegetables. And the rabbis say, that's pretty good. Okay, we're celebrating spring. We can do, spring spring vegetables like asparagus and the spring lettuce and things like that, celery, all those other parsley, nice spring vegetables. And so they incorporate that. They also look to the Romans because they're under Roman occupation at the time. And the Romans have something called a symposium, where people gather and talk about things and exchange educational ideas. And it's where the elite, mentally elite, would gather and share ideas and learn. And so they go, that's pretty good too. Kind of like take those things and some pieces of the holiday and they remodel it and they create the Seder. There's a discussion about this conscious creation in Talmud. And this is, Talmud is not written down. Mishnah is written down, and Mishnah starts to talk about it. And that's written down about 200 years of the Common Era, so around the year 200. It's redacted and written down. So somewhere between the destruction of the temple in 67 to 70, and now so the holiday changes. And I have a question here on Facebook. It's, what about babies? They didn't eat grain. That's true. They weren't weaned until they were 3 or 4 years old, because until they could eat food and until you could prepare and make a mush to be able to feed babies. So the idea that we have now of weaning babies, it's actually fairly young. It's not the 3-year-olds that it would have been back then.
They didn't have Gerber back then.
They didn't have Gerber back then. Yeah. And mom was probably nursing, one or two, more likely two, right? A new babe and an older babe. So, and you had wet nurses, and there were assorted ways that women helped each other, because you didn't have breast pumps either, and you didn't have formula. So you had to do these kinds of things, and as the kid is able to chew, has some teeth, and can handle the digestion of foods and stuff, that so they're going to be getting like gravy, and they're going to start with some mashed potato. Except we didn't have potatoes back then, because potatoes are an American vegetable. Thank you, South America. And but whatever passed for the grain, the mush, the staple, probably rice was used, because that would have traveled up and down the Silk Road as well. So those kinds of things. And although rice is never specifically mentioned in scriptures, which is one of the reasons why the rabbis in Europe kind of had to deal with rice. They weren't quite sure what to do with it, because a lot of people were saying, well, if I can't do wheat, I can do rice. I can do much of the same things with rice that I can do with wheat. No big deal. And then the rabbis are like, well, that's not really in the spirit of the holiday. It's the idea of renewing everything. So, but that's a whole nother aspect to this. So I'm looking for somebody to call in with any questions you might have at 772-340-1590.
Would you like to take a news break?
I would like to
All
take,
right.
maybe not a news break, but at least a commercial break. There we go. Congregation Eitz Chayim, your welcoming, inclusive, spiritual, and joyful Jewish home in Port St. Lucie. We welcome you to renew your inner Jew and join us. We are Reform Jewish with a renewal flair. We are multi-generational. We are welcoming to all. Come join us for a Friday night at 7:30 p.m. for our Kabbalat Shabbat services, or Stolen Moments on Saturday morning, where we discuss the Parsha of the week at 9:30 a.m. Shabbat morning services follow Stolen Moments, usually at around 10:30 a.m. Our address is 540 Northwest University, across from Met Stadium, and we are in Suite 102. Again, that's 540 Northwest University, Suite 102. Please join us for Friday nights at 7:30 p.m. or Shabbat mornings starting at 9:30 a.m. for Stolen Moments. Congregation Eitz Chayim.
Now back to Ask a Rabbi here on WPSL Digital 1590. Back to your host, Rabbi Shafir Lobb.
Thank you, and welcome back. I would love to hear from somebody with a question or a comment. And 772-340-1590. Somebody says, I thought potatoes were Irish, but not until they were brought to Europe from the New World. So potatoes was a big staple for South America, Central and South America. In fact, scholars have shown that because of potatoes, which, by the way, were not all white, they often had spots, and they come in purple and all kinds of other colors. It's just that the Irish like the white ones. And but people were not starving in South America. Whatever civilization was here before the conquistadors was able to feed itself thanks to potatoes and maize, which the Europeans looked at and said, oh, corn, which means grain. It's the British word for grain. So that's how corn got the name corn. It wasn't always a yellow thing, and there was no corn per se in Egypt. It would have been wheat or barley or oats, rye.
So more like grasses.
Yeah, right. The natural wheats that and grains and grasses that grow in the area. You don't get American stuff until people are starting to trade with America. That's when American foodstuffs go. A lot of people, I think, don't know where foods originate, and that's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of people think of spaghetti as being Italian. Well, thank you, Marco Polo, for bringing noodles from China. Right? Noodles were a Chinese staple and have always been. And when Marco Polo returned from his many years in China and went to Italy, he brought noodles and rice things with him. Gee, imagine that, the pasta making industry. And because rice was not as much a staple in Europe, they switched it over from the rice flour that's used in the Orient to using wheat. And that's one of the more interesting things. But yeah, the staple, most Chinese, the bulk of their starches are noodles or rice itself. Or dumplings. They like they'll be eating dumplings here very shortly. It'll be Chinese New Year, the beginning of February. February 6th, it'll be the year of the pig, which is supposed to be a good year for money. So hopefully it'll be a good year for folks. They've got a zodiac that assigns an animal for each year, and we're just coming off of the dog.
And each month, kind of like each month, yes. They have
they have different things for the months.
Because you can be more than, let's say you're a tiger, or you can also, it'll be the year that you're born, the month that you're like more than just a tiger.
Well, and they actually code a lot of things into their names, how they name their children. You can, if you understand how they do that, you get a lot of information, where the kid is born, when they're born, what order they are in the family. All of that's embedded in the names, if they stick to prescribed names. There's also very few surnames in China because a lot of clans are interrelated. But that we truly digress off of Judaism into Chinese culture. But things are going to travel up and down that Silk Road. To think that anybody's existing independent of each other is to be totally ignorant of the world. So, when I said that Jews are incorporating the Nowruz, it's not that Zoroastrian is earlier, but it's earlier than that part of the tradition. When the Seder changes, it's after Cyrus has released the captives, when he conquers Babylon and he releases the Jews. About 10% come back out of Babylon and can return with Ezra and Nehemiah and rebuild the temple. And the second temple looks an awful lot like an agiary, a fire temple from the Zoroastrians. A lot of people know nothing about Zoroastrians. And that's sad because the Zoroastrians have given so much to so many religions. That they gave big chunks. Some of the things that are in Christianity that did not come from Judaism come from Zoroastrianism. Big, big pieces, like 3 magi. Magi are Zoroastrian priests. So there's all kinds of things that embed themselves onto the Christian story, the Christian scriptures, that come directly out of Zoroastrianism. There's pieces in Islam that are not in Judaism or in Christianity, but that come from Zoroastrian, because the Zoroastrians they're centered in Persia, but they're going out all the way to Turkey and east and west, and they're traveling up and down the Silk Road, and their ideas are as well. And probably some foods. And so that festival of enjoying spring becomes incorporated into the Passover, or Pesach. And the Seder is the symposium. So you've got those. And then somewhere from who knows where, because it's never mentioned anywhere, show up these eggs that everybody has on their Seder.
That's funny. I was just thinking.
Yeah. That I'm guessing, and that's purely a guess on my part, is that probably has a lot more to do with old Celtic Ostara rituals of spring and fertility. Because that's what eggs are, right? Mm-hmm. As are bunnies. And all these things, we forget where they start, but they seed. Now, the bunny wouldn't make its way into Judaism because it's not kosher.
Okay.
Rabbit's not kosher. It doesn't chew its cud, and it doesn't have split hooves. So bunnies are not going to be as accepted, but the eggs apparently work their way in.
But we don't really eat the bunnies. They just deliver the eggs.
They deliver the eggs, which is really, they might as well do something. They're all over the yard. Right. And that's the point of spring and eggs.
Now, growing up, as a child, we used to always, for Easter, we always had that in the morning with our breakfast of hard-boiled eggs that were colored the night before. It was a lamb-shaped pound cake, basically. And it was all decorated like it was sitting in a field, covered in yummy icing. But I always wondered, the lamb. We always had to have a lamb. But then now I can tie the lamb to the lambing.
Right. Well, certainly an early...
So it was a symbolic little cake.
Right. Yeah. And there's an attempt to make Jesus a sacrifice, right? And to liken Jesus to the Pesach, the disposable male, which I don't think he was. They weren't certainly running around killing all the males, although Egypt certainly tried that, but a long, long time ago. And so that's a theological thing of trying to say, well, it's a misunderstanding of part of Judaism, though, right? It's the part that says, the sacrifice atones. The sacrifice doesn't atone. The sacrifice acknowledges the acceptance of forgiveness. Right. So you have to do the restitution. You have to do the being sorry, the contriteness, and all of this before you're allowed to bring a sacrifice to the temple. And there was even in Talmud, there's a discussion that says when the meat is roasted on the altar, because you're going to be eating it, they would watch the smoke, and if the smoke went up straight, then you were truly repentant, etc. But if you kind of wiggled, then you really weren't. Those are legends, right? That's putting an awful lot to it. Yeah. But people like to always assign stuff. But there's a and it's one of the reasons why Jews look at Christians and go, huh? Because Jews don't understand this idea of somebody being a sacrifice. It's like, you're talking about 2nd Avenue and they're over on, Port St. Lucie Boulevard. Right. They don't intersect, right? I'm hoping that 2nd doesn't. I don't know the map of Port St. Lucie well enough at this point. But right, so the roads don't even intersect between those two ideas, and so you get this cognitive I don't get it kind of a look. But it's part of the Christian theology, right, to want to make Jesus into a lamb. So that's why you had the lamb cake, right? Because it's that time of year in spring, and that's when the lambs are out in the field. So it's when shepherds are dealing with the lambkins. And somebody, is saying that eggs are a mnemonic of eternity. That's because they're an oval and it goes round and round and round. And but that's actually a later addition on it. It's that chickens start laying eggs in the spring, and rabbits start showing up in the spring, and flowers come, and love is in the air, and all of that's going on. So spring is just naturally a time of rebirth and renewal and revitalization. Trees are flowering, my allergies are up, all those other good things that happen in spring. And there's a Hindu festival of Holi, which is also a spring festival. Now this is totally, I don't know, but the festival of Holi involves taking bright colored powders and colored waters and spraying everybody and everything with them. And that's a spring celebration, a renewal kind of joyful coloring thing. And I sometimes wonder if the coloring of the eggs is not somehow connected, tied into it, because there's just a little too much similarity between the bright colored eggs and they're doing that with the color. But I don't know of any sources where I can say, yeah, somebody has looked at that. But it's kind of interesting to me. And it's Holi, but it's pronounced holy. And that's their spring festival. Yeah, when you start looking at all the different religions, you discover that everybody's got a spring festival. Everybody's got all these basic different kinds of festivals, as long as there's an agricultural part of the culture that's dealing with it. So when we look at older religious traditions and older cultures like Hindu, Chinese, Jewish, you're going to have a lunar calendar. And that's one of the ways you can tell when something's older. Although Islam uses a lunar calendar, but the reason you can tell that they're divorced from farming is because they don't intercalate it. They don't tie it to the solar calendar. Right? So your barley is going to sprout at a certain time every year. And it doesn't care what month you're in. It's when the conditions are right, they come out of the ground, and just like daffodils up north. We don't know from daffodils down here.
That's spring.
Right. That's spring, right? Yeah. And so what the old cultures do, like the Chinese, Jewish, is that we have an extra month. It's 7 times in 19 years. And the Chinese are actually the same. They've got a leap month, and that's why Chinese New Year appears to move on the calendar, because the Gregorian calendar is a solar calendar. It's not tied to the lunar cycle at all. It's based on an arbitrary number of days, and it's purely a solar calendar. But the Jewish calendar is lunar. Muhammad used a lunar calendar for Islam because, again, it's easy. Even though he starts to really get into timekeeping, and the Swiss watch movement is an Arab timekeeping that they brought to Europe. Yeah, thank you, Silk Road. Thank you, Conquest. All of these things. Just here's another piece of trivia about Islam. Brought the guitar to Spain. How a lot of things that are Spanish, and it's why some words in Spanish and Arabic are so similar. It's because of the time of the Moors, the time of the Muslims in Spain. They brought a lot of things. They also brought infectious disease protocols and surgical instruments and time movements. Those things come out of the Arab world. We're much more integrated and mingled than we begin to think. So when we look back at the calendar, coming back to the calendar, older traditions will use the lunar calendar because it's really easy. Every night you can look up and you have a pretty good idea of where you are. So Jewish festivals, amazingly, happen on full moons. They're usually on the 14th or 15th of the month, which is the full moon. And that, again, not by accident, but that's a good time when you don't have a lot of electric and you don't have a lot of easy candles. They're expensive. That's a good time for a festival because the streets are lit by the moon. So you're going to have a lot more festivals at that time. But it's easy to keep track of on a lunar calendar. We're going to have a leap year this year, and that's why things are going to shift a little bit. And what we do is we add a whole month, because you can't add half of a lunar cycle. You can't just add a day. It kind of messes everything up.
But even with a whole month, you still don't have enough time to do things, right?
Oh, that would be correct. I never have enough time to do everything. That's a chronic problem. So, okay, so anybody have a question for me? It's really quiet today, folks. 772-340-1590. Anybody interested in a question on the calendar or on festivals? I also said that we would talk a little bit about Purim, so let's back up and look at Purim. We talked about Passover, Pesach. So coming back to Purim, Purim is the month right before Pesach. Now, I've got, as a baker, I think that part of the reason for Purim is so that you use up all the baked goods you got in the house. You make cookies and all kinds of fillings. For me, it cleans out my my pantry nicely. And then I'm prepared for Pesach in a month because the spring cleaning that takes place with it. But Purim is a festival that a lot of non-Jews don't know anything about. It's a dress-up, upside-down, mix-up holiday where everything turns on itself. It's rooted in the book of Esther and celebrated, interestingly, a day later in walled cities. So Jerusalem, Jericho, and it's walled in the time of Jericho. So Jerusalem and some other cities will celebrate it a day later because they're walled. It took an extra day to, according to the book of Esther, for the battle to occur in the walled cities. That kind of makes sense if you understand walled cities. They're not easy to conduct warfare inside. But Purim is all about turnarounds. People making plans, God laughing and switching them around, so that Haman plans to hang Mordecai. The heroes are Mordecai, who's a Jew, and his niece Esther, who becomes queen of Persia, and Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, and Haman, his minister, his vizier, who's out to kill the Jews. And it's a very convoluted, weird story. There's also the first queen whose name is Vashti, and the story's kind of weird about how she gets banished, and the king has a fit. He's having a drinking party, a 6-month drinking party, because everybody has 6-month drinking parties. You read the book, and you want to talk about numbers not making sense. The book of Esther is definitely in there. So there's a 6-month drinking party toward the end of it. While Vashti is having a party for the women at her palace, he's having a drinking party with the guys, and he summons her and she won't come. And he has a fit, and his advisors say, well, if you don't lay down the law to her and banish her, then no man will be in charge of his house. All the women will just revolt and they'll not obey their husbands. And so, according to the book of Esther, the king issues a decree that all men shall rule their households. And well, you've got to move to ancient Persia to get there. It's law, Persian law. And along the way, there's this interchange between Mordecai and Haman, where Mordecai won't bow down to Haman. We don't hear that Mordecai, by the way, doesn't bow down to the king, but he won't bow down to Haman. Why won't he bow down to Haman? Well, because 500 years or 1,000 years ago, there was this tiff between our families, and you're an Agagite and I'm a Jew, and it's all totally insane. But there's this big feud between the two of them, and so Haman, because he's vizier, decides to get rid of all Jews. It's an easy way to get rid of Haman, but he's planning on hanging Mordecai in his backyard in a gallows that's a mere 75 feet high. Right, everybody puts one of those in their backyard. I don't think so.
Maybe a foot wasn't a foot.
It's 50 cubits high. Yeah, maybe it wasn't a cubit is a cubit, about 18 inches. And and people don't catch that. There's all kinds of really crazy stuff in that book. And the king, in his attempt to replace Vashti, whom he has banished and divorced, he causes a search to, for all of the virgins in the entire 127 provinces of his kingdom. And it's the Scheherazade story. It's one girl a night. And if she pleases the king, great, he'll have something else with her. And the one that he really likes, he's going to make queen. Well, about 6, and it takes them 6 months to prepare for their one night with the king. Or maybe, no, I think it's a year. It's 6 months with oil and 6 months with perfume to get ready to have their one night with the king. And Esther goes and he falls in love with her and she becomes the queen of Persia. The king is not Jewish, by the way. And when the plot thickens between Mordecai and Haman, Esther becomes aware of it. She sets up a number of drinking parties, and at one of those, she says, "Oh, King, I plead for my life." And the king says, "Well, who's after you?" And she says, "This guy." Haman's at the drinking party, and the story gets really crazy even after that. It's a fun story. It's basically a spring cabin fever carnival kind of festival. The instructions, the Jewish tradition is that you need to get merry enough, perhaps with alcohol or wine, so that you cannot tell the difference between a blessing and a curse. So that's pretty sodded. And so I actually wonder if some of the early European anti-Semitism occurred thanks to that leap year that we talked about. So this is going to tie everything together. If the Jews were doing their Purim thing with getting drunk and hanging Haman in effigy, overlaid Easter, and created some really bad feelings. Here you have a people who's really down about Good Friday, etc., and here you've got Jews running around drunk and partying. And so I could see where if you don't understand each other, that could really be a bad scene. And every so many years, that happens. That Easter is a month off on the Jewish calendar. Passover is going to be a month later. It's when Easter occurs very early because of the sun calendar and the equinox and how it's determined. And every once in a while, it overlays Purim. And I wonder if that didn't happen in Europe. I don't know if we could figure that out by going back in the calendar and seeing if it was a leap year. We know which years are leap years in the Jewish calendar. So you might be able to back calculate some of that.
Or just ask Siri.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there you go. Siri. Yeah. Well, it depends. You kind of have
to. What day
was
was Easter in the year?
Yeah.
It'll do it.
Well, of course it will.
Yeah.
But you have to look up when the pogroms were and when the riots, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And right. So, yeah.
Which story are you going to tell your radio audience? The G-rated one or the X-rated one?
She's going to be telling the G-rated one.
Yeah. So okay. So what he's alluding to is if you
I'd hate to have to dump the rabbi.
Yeah. So
dump the rabbi. That's a fun game.
Dump the rabbi.
$5 to throw the ball.
I've been there. Dunk the rabbi. Yes, thank you. So what he's alluding to is the Book of Esther is really has a lot of sexual innuendo in it, to put it mildly. And one of my memories of it comes from it was again Tucson of all crazy places, but you do Purim plays. It's one of the ways that you celebrate the festival.
I was always
Purim spiel. You were always. I'm not surprised, but there was a scene we had actually done it. You might get a kick out of this one, where one of the women in the congregation dressed up as Achashverosh, and one of the guys dressed up as Esther. We were doing it a la drag that year. And one of the women who kept saying, "Oh, I don't understand Esther. I don't understand Esther at all." And she's standing there with a pole to be the scepter. And Esther is dancing and parading, in front of her because it's her night in the play, and it's when she comes to get the attention of the king to invite him to the drinking parties, and he extends the golden scepter to her because that's required if you're going to approach the king if you haven't been summoned. And so she's standing there with it, and she holds it out, and with that motion she goes, I get it now. Right. So it's what is the golden scepter? You can use your imagination. And there's another great line in there that's kind of funny. In the beginning of the book, it talks about the king having this drinking party for his ministers, both large and small. It doesn't say great and minor. It says large and small. Again, you can read something into that or not, your choice. It's a funny book. It's not at all serious.
So essentially, you teach the Hebrew school kids one story and the adults another one.
I teach the same story. I just let the adults understand a little bit more. Because the and we have an adults only Purim celebration where we're a little more clear about what's being talked about. It's a very dirty book. And it's in the section of Jewish scriptures called literature. It's a story. It's not history. It's a story. It's a Megillah. Megillot are stories. They're not scriptures. They're certainly not prophecy. They're just they're holy literature. Why are they holy? Well, that you might as well join the discussion in Talmud that goes on for volumes about why is this a sacred story or not. And there are many books, and there's actually a section in Talmud where Esther is pleading with the rabbis to accept her book into the canon. Because they're like, why should we put a carnival story in scriptures? And she makes a plea, and they accept it. But again, odds are it became so canonized because it was a popular story. Lots of popular stories in Jewish scriptures. There's a number of Megillot. That would be a topic for another time of Ask a Rabbi. So lots of good things coming. So please check our website, check Facebook, and please join us for Purim. And then we also will be starting to advertise soon for the Pesach Seder. And I can tell you right now that's going to be a Friday night and a Saturday night, first and second nights. And I'm going to guess that it's going to be the same $36 that it's been the last couple of years for a full ritual dinner. So please register. We're looking at a bigger venue for having our Seder this year. So we expect to be able to handle a much larger volume. And that'll be in April.
You have a website?
We do have a website. It's www.eitzchayim.org. Eitz Chayim, which means tree of life.org. Or you can look for us on Facebook. This is Rabbi Lobb for Ask a Rabbi.